Hi everyone, happy Halloween. We're going to have a bit of fun now. So I want you to completely relax. We're not going for a perfect picture here at all. This is pure fun. It's so you can relax, not take it so seriously, and we can just see what happens if we let the paint just do its thing. But the key ingredient here is going to be water. Now what I'm doing is I'm just mixing up the colour for the eyes. So I've drawn out my little cat and I'm mixing up a nice sort of yellow. I'm using cadmium yellow, and then I'm adding a tiny bit of yellow ochre to the side of it. And then I've got a little bit, what have I got there? Oh, I've got a little bit of burnt sienna if I want to add a little bit of brown as well. So zooming in here, we're going to wet the eyes, stay away from the central black part of the eye. Doesn't really matter if you go over it because it's going to be black later anyway. And I've added little highlights in the eyes, so try not to paint into those as well. And we're just going to paint the yellow, the first layer. Now you can pre-wet it or you can go straight in. I've decided to go quite wet with this because that's the whole practice. It's getting really loose with water for this little moggy exercise. So you can see that's a real puddle in there for the eyes. And then I'm just getting a little bit of sap green and I'm just dropping it in where it's nice and wet, just around the central part of the eye. And I'm letting it just bleed into the yellow exactly how it wants to. So I'm not really putting it in a particular direction. I'm just dropping it in and then just giving it a little nudge to help it along. And it's also at the sides of the eyes, around the edges, I'm using a warmer mix of the yellow ochre with a little bit of the burnt sienna in it, just a tiny bit. You don't want them to go brown. Just at the edges to give it a bit more of a depth because I don't want it bright yellow. I want them to be a little bit more, what's the word? Just a bit warmer, really, a warmer yellow. And then that's it. Just let it merge and do its thing. And you're going to need to leave this to dry completely. And then I'm just adding a little bit more green. Just want to strengthen that green just a little bit more. Just dotting it really. Just drop it in and then leave it, and we'll see how this is going to dry later. Now you're going to have to let this completely dry before we even attempt to paint the black cat. Otherwise we're going to end up with a big yellowy black mess. So eyes need to dry completely. Use a hairdryer if you need to. Okay, so you're going to need a large brush, like a mop brush, or use the biggest brush that you've got. And then with a nice clean bowl of water, I want you to wet the whole area, avoiding the eyes. So fill right up to your pencil line, to the edges. You can see with it glistening, you can see where I'm going. Now, I'm being really careful here. I don't want to go too close to the eyes because I don't want there to be any risk of it running in. And because the black is going to be, it's just going to have black eyes right around the eyes. It's going to be black. So I can leave a little bit of space. I don't have to go right up to where the yellow eyes are at the moment with the water. I can always fill it in afterwards. That's what I'm trying to say, because that bit is going to be completely black. So that's okay to do. So fill in his feet. And you do need a lot of water here. It's probably going to dry on you as you do this first layer. And that's fine, because we can go over it again. So just filling in the tail. And then go over it again. You can see the puddles on the water. It's really, really wet. Now I did this in a sketchbook, so I didn't stretch my paper. If you have got stretched paper, you'll probably get a better result. But if you're just practicing like I am, it's just for fun. You can use a sheet app, your notebook, or you can just tape it with a bit of masking tape or something to your table. Now, you're going to need a spare brush to one side. Again, big brush, clean, and keep clean water. And this is literally in case you need to add any more water as you go. Because if it starts to dry out on us, we might need to urgently wet the paper. And it's better if you've got a nice clean dry brush to one side ready for that, because you're never going to get the black out of this paintbrush that we're using. So I'm just mixing up lots and lots and lots of black. You're going to need a lot. If you've got a black tube, I would recommend using your tube. It's going to be a lot easier because, as you can see, I'm trying to hold my little pan that's come out of my palette, and they move about, they wiggle around, and it's just a bit of a faff, and you want to make this as easy as possible. So we've got plenty of paint mixed up, and here we go, we're just going for it. I'm going to start in the center, and I'm being really liberal with how much. I'm just taking time to make pointy ears to give that the shape, and the rest of it is really down to a force of nature, really, what the paint and the paper want to do. I'm going around the eyes, trying to work fairly quickly, make sure I've got enough paint on, not really worrying about my brush strokes so much because I don't think you're really going to see much of that when it dries. You can see that lovely smokiness at the corner of the ear already, it's doing something. So I'm filling in up to the pencil marks, put his feet in. You can see it's bleeding. I've got nice edges bleeding already. Now I'm using a squirrel mop, and they're really thirsty brushes. They do hold a lot of paint. I don't think this was the best thing to use for this project. I would have used a synthetic looking backwards. Now it's a bit of a decision to do on his back because he's got a lovely smokiness coming from the ears. I didn't want to go right up to the ears, so I've kind of sort of just splodged it on the back bit and just left it. And then I've moved over to the right hand side for his the back of him and his tail. Now I've noticed with this first exercise, because I went right up to my pencil mark and that's as far as I put the wet paper, it hasn't travelled any further than that. The paint can't go anywhere, you see, because it's stopped. It stopped where the paper wasn't wet anymore. So this is where my spare brush comes in, and I'm just going in with some clean water, and I'm ever so carefully just wetting the edges to give it somewhere else to travel. You see the tail? The edges can't go anywhere unless I give it more water. It can't spread any further. It will always stop when it hits the dry paper. Now this was just an experiment to see how far this will travel. So I've tried to just do a couple of sweeps there, and that's it. I don't want to mess with it too much. And then I'm just going in and darkening the ears just a little bit. And then I'm going to tidy up around the eyes. I've got my smaller brush now, if you can see. It's really hard to judge what to do and what not to do here. I think less is more. Less fiddling is best. You have to make decisions on what's the most important thing because you've only got time to do one thing here. And for me, I wanted to fill in these eyes because I want the black completely around the eyes. If you left it till it was dry and then you tried to paint the eyes in, you're going to have this harsh, it looks like it's got, mascara on. And we want it to blend. So while it's still damp, you can see the paper is glistening. This is when we want to get this done. So are you breathing or are you holding your breath? Because for most of this, I think I held my breath for the full couple of minutes. I was concentrating so much, I forgot to breathe. So do remember to breathe. I also stood up when I did this, and I sort of planted my legs like John Wayne so that I had like complete control over this. And by standing over it, it also allowed me to see where the paper was still wet. I could sort of move my head side to side so I could see the sheen of the wetness on the paper, so I could see where I've still had a bit of time to play with. So that's a little tip as well. If you're doing something like this and you're able to, just stand up and lean over. It might give you a little backache for a moment, but it's worth it because you feel like you've got more control. If not, do the best you can. But I kind of wanted to. It was like I was ready to really go for it. So I did my John Wayne stance. So here I'm just fiddling a little bit. I'm just adding a bit here and there, but very, very reserved. I don't want to do a lot. I really want to see what it's going to do on its own. And you could do this over and over, different ways, and just see what effects you get. See the bottom of the tail, I've left that bit dry because I need to be able to see the difference. So the top of the tail, I wet over it, over the edge. I sort of brushed along the edge to let the top of the tail travel a little bit more. I gave it a bit more water. And then at the bottom, I just left it where I painted it right up to the end of the wet space. So I'm just using a clean, dry brush to remove a little bit from the edges of the eyes and the nose. But it doesn't work that well. It gives you a little bit of light. But if you wanted a white nose, you'd probably be better to mask it before you wet it. And here is a quick picture of my moggy. I took a picture before it dried. And then what we're going to have to do is completely leave this to dry. I would avoid using a hairdryer because you are going to disturb the paint. I would rather just let it completely dry. I think mine took a couple of hours actually. It depends how warm your room is. If you're doing this in the summertime, it's going to dry really quick, and I would avoid doing this in a really warm room. But here in England, it's autumn, pretty cold. So I just went away and left this, and yeah, it did take a couple of hours, but it's worth waiting. Maybe you could leave it overnight and then come back and do the eyes and finishing touches in the morning. Or if you're doing this in the morning, obviously leave it for longer, but this is where I left it, and then I did not touch it again. Okay, so Moggy, take two. As you can see, Moggy number one, he's drying on the right, and I thought, let's just do it again, learn what I did from the first one, and just make some slight changes to get a different effect. And it's all about repetition and practice with watercolour. So I've done exactly the same thing. My eyes are painted, they're completely dried. I just repeated the process. I used a hairdryer to blast them and dry them a bit because you can't move them around that much. So it's fine to use a hairdryer to dry the eyes and speed that up for yourself. And then the same brush, and I wet the Moggy again. But what I did this time is I'm going to focus on having plenty of water again, but also I'm not going to paint right up to the edges of the wet bit. I want to stop before the paint gets to the edge of where the paper is wet, because I want it to travel. I want to get a really smoky, fuzzy, fluffy cat. So in order to get that fluffy edge, I can't go right up to the edge like I did before. So we're going to do this differently. Okay. I painted a bit too close there with the water to the eye, so I just blotted it out so I didn't make any mistakes there. And then I'm going to stand up. I'm going to get my John Wayne stance again, and I'm going to take a deep breath. Remember to breathe, and then we're going to go for it. So again, I'm going to mix up lots of black. Try to mix up enough that you're not going to have to remix. It's hard to know if you're going to or not. And then deep breath. And I'm going to start at the back this time. Now you see I'm not going right up to that edge. I'm allowing it to bleed naturally into the water. So I've done the edge and then I've left it alone. I'm not going to mess with the edges. I want to get a really natural spreading of the paint. So I'm just slowly taking the paint down the edges and then letting it do its thing. And I'm going down the middle of the tail. Make sure I've got a nice end on there. And then I'm just going to go down the middle. So it's wet on the paper either side of the tail. And that's the secret. You have to give it some room to travel. And then I'm going in with the ears. I mean, this one's totally different. I feel like I know a little bit more already just from doing that first attempt. I'm spending a bit of time here on the ears rather than going back on them later like I did on the first one. I'm moving my way down the cat slowly. And that's giving me a bit more control, which is nice. Because the paper is plenty wet. I've got my emergency water and brush next to me if I need to wet that paper again. And I think I'm painting this a lot more calmly than I did the first one. So I've taken the time to go around the eye, and that's going to give me a nicer finish. Oh, here I go. Yeah, it's looking a bit dry where I'm about to go. So I've taken the time to wet the paper again before I move forward. Now that's going to be really quite wet when I go into that. So I have to bear that in mind. That's going to move a bit faster than the previous application did. So just helping it to the edge and then leaving it. It's so much fun just watching it. And it's a really good practice in knowing when not to fiddle. I say it so much, don't I? Stop fiddling. But we love to fiddle. So I'm going slowly around the eye here. That's it. And I can see, because I haven't overworked the layers, the paint is going to really do its own thing on this one. And then we're going to come down to his little paws. And I'm just tilting the brush so it's going to help me to get that sort of fluffy edge. So there's a mixture of being dainty and kind of going for it. It's a blend between the two. Because if I put too much paint on in one big blob, it might not get the effect. But if I'm too timid, it's going to take me too long, and I won't get a nice sort of finish on it. Because the paper is going to dry by the time I've got enough paint on if I'm too timid. So it's a bit of a mix between the two. Now here at the bottom of the cat's tail, I've decided to add a bit of water like I did at the beginning for the first cut. And just around the edge of his feet, just to see what happens, really. Oh, that right paw's gone a bit wonky. He's going to have a bit of a club foot there, I think. So I'm just adding a bit more paint in. You get one shot at it, really, and it's a decision you may or may not regret. I know I was in two minds. I thought, oh, is this going to ruin it? But I thought, okay, we'll just add a little bit of extra depth to it, and we'll see how it dries. I think I regretted doing this, actually. I'm looking at my picture now. Yeah, it did add more depth to it, but it does disturb the layers that are drying. And again, this is why it's all about practice. I can't comment much about the feet. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, I'm going to have to make that left one bigger, otherwise it's going to have really odd feet. I know it doesn't look much like a cat at the moment, but trust the process and make sure you leave this to dry completely. Now, just as a bit of an experiment for me, I had a little spray bottle here with some water in it. And I've never really played about with this much. I know a lot of watercolour artists do. But I thought I'd give them a little spray of water and see if that makes any difference whatsoever. I think it made the feet worse. Yeah, so I've gone in with a dry brush and I'm just trying to tidy just a little bit without disturbing the edges. That's really important. Okay, so we're going back to Moggy number 1. and he's completely and utterly dry. So I'm using a small fine brush and I'm going to fill in the eye detail. So I'm going to start by painting in the black centre of the eye, taking care to go around and leave those white highlights. Cat's eyes are so striking, aren't they? The contrast of that bright colour of the iris. So do your best to get them level so they look the same. The reflections will be different, so look at your reference picture. This is where you sort of build your character in. So I'm not sure at the moment if my cat's going to end up looking a bit startled or if he's going to look a bit angry. Or if he's a happy cat, I don't know. I've no idea till I put the final details in. I've given him a little nose as well. And this is your time. If you want to just tidy any little edges and add any details, you can do, or you can leave it completely as it is and just let the watercolour do its thing. I don't really want to disturb any of the edges. I'm just putting in a couple of little lines in his paws and a little suggestion of a nose, just little things like that. And then, of course, we can add his whiskers later. And just tidy up around his eyes, make sure the shape of the eye is defined. And it's really easy to do because it's so black. You can literally just use the black to sharpen those edges and make his eyes a little bit more round and defined. It just tidies it up. And I was trying to put a bit of a nose in here because removing it with the dry brush earlier didn't really work. It didn't really do anything. So I'm just trying to put a little smile on his face here, but you can't see much, to be honest, because he is so dark. And just a little bit of definition on the ears. Now, depends how dark you've done your cat. If you've ended up with a really like grey, smoky cat, this would be the stage at which you could put in some like fur textures. And if you did like a tortoiseshell and you started with a really light brown, you could then go over with some sort of warmer browns and richer tones to build up like a tortoiseshell effect, or, you know, the fluff and the markings that lots of cats have. With it being black, there's not that much I can do. I'm just having a little play here to see if I can get a little definition between his ears to suggest that, you know, to separate his head from his body, really, to give it a little bit of depth. But that's about all I can do because it is so dark. And then let this dry, and then we'll do a little bit of finishing touch on his eyes. Okay, so he's nice and dry. And now we're going to just add a little bit more colour into his eyes. I just want to warm them up a little bit because they've dried very yellow. I've got that nice sort of green tinge in there as well. And I'm just using some burnt sienna and I'm going around the edges. Just to add a bit more colour. It's completely up to you what you want to do. You could go for some really crazy green eyes here. It's up to you. Now you see where that's running a little bit. It's because the black wasn't quite dry. So I've made a little bit of a mistake there, but it's okay. We can sort of blot that out afterwards. Just take it away with a dry brush and wait for it to stop running. It's not a disaster. You can manage that. You can keep on top of little things like that. But again, it's just not letting things dry properly. Things can bleed. So I'll go over to the other eye while the other one's drying a bit. This is quite a fun thing to do, just to build up those eye colours. A lovely lesson to do would be literally just to do like a cat's eye, because they're absolutely fascinating, all the different colours in there. Maybe that's something we'll do at one point, just to focus on an eye study. So I'm just trying to control that that black from running in the eye there a little bit. And then finally we can do the best bit. We can do the whiskers. He's all nice and dry. And I'm just using a fine black marker here to add in his whiskers. You could use a pencil or you could use your paintbrush, but I find a pen is a little bit more effective. And here are my two cats. You can see they're a little bit different. And the one on the right is the one that we did first. And I quite like the markings on the sides where I used the water to the wet clean brush to just touch the edges. I just sort of did a clean sweep because I hadn't wet them enough to start with. And I think I quite like the odd like sort of bleeding that it's got there. And then on the left, you've got a complete contrast to that if you look at the tail, because that's where I allowed all the water on the paper either side of where I applied the paint. So I just painted down the center of the tail, didn't go to the edges, and I just let it bleed into the wet as much as it wanted to. It had plenty of space to travel. And I think that's the key with the wet in wet technique. The paint needs to be able to move, and how wet your paper is and how far the wet paper goes is going to dictate where your paint goes and how far it travels, really, and how much sort of momentum it's going to have. If it's really wet, it's just going to sort of shoot everywhere. But if it's just damp, it's just going to creep ever so slowly, and it gives you a little bit more control. So it's something definitely to practice. But I hope you've enjoyed it. They're quite good fun. And coming up, I've got one more little Halloween cat, which is really great fun. And this takes this a little bit further. So I hope you've enjoyed this.